All right, hey everyone, all six of you. I love it. That lets us talk, or lets me talk a little more personally, and hopefully I can connect with you all more. My first presentation, they actually asked a lot of questions throughout, and I think I liked how that went. So if you have a question, raise your hand, interrupt me, and I'll answer, because I'm not here to talk at you. I'm here to engage with you and learn. Right? So my name is Ben Asher. I'm a mission design engineer over at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. So mission design engineer, I say I'm like Google Maps for space, except there aren't really any roads. So that adds a little bit of a challenge, but and then today we're going to be planning a trip to the moon. We're gonna explore that together, and I promise I will talk about the eclipse. Right. So a little bit more about what I do is I work for Deep Space Logistics, which is a project that supplies cargo to NASA's Gateway. So Gateway is going to be a space station orbiting the moon. And I'm sure folks have heard about Artemis, moon missions. Yeah, so we had Artemis 1 fly about a year and a half ago. And then, so that was no crew on board, and the vehicle just went around the moon, came back. Artemis 2 will send crew. Artemis 3 will go direct to the lunar surface. And Artemis 4 is going to be the first one where you see Gateway starting to be built. And so the whole premise with Gateway is that you can assemble all your pieces to go down to the moon before launch, right? And so if you remember the Apollo missions, we sent it all at once, but now we can assemble the pieces here, and once it's all staged and ready to go, then you send your crew up. And there's more living space, there's more cargo, there's a bigger lander, right? You don't have to all constrain it into one vehicle. All right, so when we design a mission, what I'm going to be biased and say we do is design our cargo mission to go up to Gateway, right? So remember, we're planning a mission to the moon together, and so we need to deliver cargo to Gateway. That's our goal. So let's talk a little bit about that. By first talking about the big picture for Artemis 4. So I don't expect you to read all this. The main point here is that there's a lot going on, right? So Gateway is orbiting the moon, this large gray orbit, very elliptical orbit. And so the goal is to get our cargo to that orbit. The lander, the human landing system, is also going to rendezvous and dock with Gateway at that orbit. And then once all that's ready, Orion will launch off of the SLS rocket. You see the orange rocket top left. It'll launch the Orion capsule up. They'll do their lunar mission, and then the capsule brings the crew back home. So there's a lot of moving parts, especially compared to like Apollo. And all of it needs to work together to make Artemis successful. So let's go back to just the cargo module, we'll call it. So how do you actually get to the moon, right? That line that was on there is nice and all, but how do you actually fly there and navigate through the different gravities of the moon and the sun, and Earth? And yeah, so that, like, which path do you take? Which vehicle do you take on your route? Like, how big of a launch vehicle do you need? And then what are the hazards in space? What do we have to worry about or think about on our journey out to the moon? And I find it most helpful as a mission design engineer to think backwards. Start with the goal in mind and then work your way back home. All right. So let's talk about the goal, which is the Gateway orbit. So traditional Apollo orbit was this 100-kilometer altitude circular orbit above the moon. This is where the orbiter was, and then the vehicle dropped down from there to the surface, which works for going just to the surface, but Gateway has other objectives. Gateway wants to be able to change its orbit and provide comm access to the south pole of the moon, and so we can use the gravity between Earth, Moon, and the Sun to design this orbit. It looks a little wonky, right? And what it does is it gives us good coverage of the South Pole. It gives us, in terms of view of the South Pole, it's a pretty stable orbit. Our lunar orbits are generally very unstable because of the Earth and Sun moving you around. And it avoids eclipses. So, see, told you I was going to talk about eclipses. So we'll dive into more detail, but just know that that is a consideration in our mission design. All right. So that was our orbit that we want to get to, that we want to arrive at. So Gateway's already there, ideally, in our scenario. So we just need to dock with it. So how do we get from the Earth to the Moon? We have two methods. We have the direct lunar transfer and this ballistic lunar transfer, which looks a little crazy. So the direct lunar transfer shown is what Orion does. It's what the class like Apollo missions did, where you just launch the rocket, you head straight there, and you get there in the short time of 3 to 4 days. And that's just arriving at the moon. And then once you get to that lowest point by the moon, you got to hit the brakes, or else you'll just keep flying by. All right, so once you hit the brakes, you then go down so the NRHO orbit is the name of the Gateway orbit. You go into the orbit there, and that's another 3 days. So it takes a week for the astronauts just to get to the station. And then from there, the lander goes down, and by the time it comes back up and the crew goes home, their whole mission is about a month. And we're hoping longer as the Artemis program goes further. But yeah, so the issue here is you really have to hit the brakes when you arrive. So you got to bring a lot of fuel with you on your journey. There's nowhere to refuel on the way. So you got to, so that you're limited in how much mass you can bring up to Gateway. But the ballistic lunar transfer, it uses some cool dynamics at the expense of duration. So this is actually a 100-day or so journey from launch until you get to the moon. And what you do is you can see the moon's orbit here, this gray dotted line. That's how far the moon is orbiting around the Earth. So we're going well past that. And what that does is the sun helps to tug on the spacecraft and change its orbit for free, essentially. And then you fall back into the moon, and you get to use less brakes. So that means you get to save propellant, which means you can bring more stuff, which is good, especially if we want to stay there at the moon longer. So these are kind of our options, roads to take. Yeah?
Has that ballistic one actually been tested?
Yes, it has. Actually, if you've seen on the news recent landers on the moon,
Yeah.
so JAXA or Japan had a lander on the moon. U.S. through a U.S. company, I think it was Intuitive Machines, landed on the moon. I believe those used the ballistic lunar transfer to get there.
That just sounds like a concept, but doesn't sound like it would actually work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I cite the paper here, so I'm not plagiarizing, but yeah, it's a technical paper, and it shows all the different, and each one of those is a different launch date, essentially. That's what that's showing. And they're actually doing flybys of the moon. You can kind of see an elbow on the way out, like it's not just a straight line, it kind of curves. So it does a lunar flyby on the way, yeah. So it's, yep, so that's what we plan on doing for a lot of our missions, if we can. All right, so then which launch vehicle do we use? All right, so we know where we're going. We know of the ways we can get there. Which launch vehicle do you use? And frankly, it depends even more. Of course, I can't give you a straightforward answer, or else I'd be like talking myself out of a job or something. So we have a bunch of options here, and some other ones that aren't shown, like New Glenn, Vulcan rocket, as well as the Ariane rocket. So what's the difference and benefit of all of these different rockets? So the Saturn V and Space Shuttle we'll just leave there for reference. I guess we'll start with the big shiny one on the right, the Starship. You've probably seen a lot of news and hubbub about Starship testing. They're still developing it. NASA chose the Starship as the first human lander to go to, or first human lander for Artemis to go to the moon. And the concept there is they'll launch this into low Earth orbit, and they'll send many more missions to refuel it. And once they've topped off the tanks, then they'll head out to the moon. And the reason why they need a full tank is because they're going all the way down into the moon's gravity well and having to come all the way back out again with the astronauts. So we need this to just launch a satellite off of Earth. Imagine same thing but the moon. Luckily the moon's only the 1/6 of the gravity of the Earth, but you still need a lot of oomph. Right? And so speaking of a lot of oomph, the SLS rocket. So this is NASA's designed rocket, and what it does is instead of recovering the pieces, it throws them all away, uses every ounce of performance to get Orion to orbit. The Orion is the human capsule, or the capsule full of humans that are going out to Gateway. So you can see it's taken a lot of heritage from the shuttle. You see the same kind of solid rocket motors on the side, except they've added an extra booster segment. And then you see that same hydrogen tank. It's still using the same shuttle engines, except there's 4 instead of 3. And then the second stage of the launch vehicle has also been enhanced. So a very powerful and very capable rocket. And then you kind of have a mix with the Falcon Heavy, where it will recover some, if not all, of its boosters on ascent, and the second stage of the rocket is not recovered. All right, so it holds back some performance to do some of that recovery, but also they've realized that for the needs of Gateway, we can't hold them all the boosters back. All right, so we'll talk about launch vehicles. So I said it depends. So what does it depend on, right? And these are just a few things. There's a lot more, but the biggest thing is mass, right? So let's imagine you're planning a road trip across the country. If it's you and your kid, you need like a suitcase, some food supplies, maybe some munchies, and fortunately you don't have to bring all your gas you need with you, right? So you're probably just taking a car, maybe a van, right? You don't need an 18-wheeler to haul you and your kid across the country, right? But if you start adding more and more stuff, maybe start turning into like a U-Haul, or maybe it does even go into an 18-wheeler sort of thing. So we got to consider all that when we're choosing which vehicle to fly with. And so for our mission, because we're designing the cargo mission, Gateway is requiring a minimum of 4,400 kilograms of cargo to the moon. So that's about 9,500 pounds. So a lot for going to the moon. And then it's also pressurized cargo, right? So it has to be in an atmosphere. You got to have that air conditioned, because you're probably bringing up like food and water and whatnot, and you don't want it to freeze or get too hot for that matter. So then you need to bring like a whole essentially AC system or HVAC to condition your air. And then also in space, there's not gravity to help air move around. So you gotta do all that yourself. And that's just the environments for the cargo. Not even talking about the structure and the propellant and the power. So all that starts stacking up to give you more and more mass, right? In order to take care of this cargo. So flight duration. We touched on it with the direct transfer versus the slow transfer, right? So if your crew, I forgot if I said this already, so I apologize. If your crew, you want to go straight there, most likely, right? You don't want to go on a 100-day journey in the car. But if it's a robotic mission or if it's just cargo, why not, right? And it depends, right? So you'll have some, again, the food thing. Some of the food is perishable. It has a shelf life. You don't want to be sending up stale or expired food up for the astronauts. So it's important you don't go too long, right? You can't just take forever, but there is a balance point in there. And then all the rest of these kind of couple together, or at least three of them: solar power generation, communication with Earth, and eclipses. So we need power on board to power like I said, the AC unit and the other systems on board. And that makes sense. You get some solar panels, point at the sun, you're good. Well, you also need to be talking with Earth. Like, what if the Earth's behind you and the sun's in front of you? So then it starts getting a little complicated. You got to turn and talk to Earth and give health and status updates, make sure you're going where you're supposed to go. But then if you're not doing that, you're not generating power. What's nice about hydroelectric power is it doesn't care if it's day or night. So to get around that, spacecrafts will pack enough batteries for what they believe the operations would require, right? Another thing that would impact that are eclipses. So obviously, if you're behind the moon, you can't see the sun, which kind of goes to why we're all here this week. Or actually, I'm sure most of you live here, but that's why I'm here this week. And then, in addition to blocking the sun, it also can block communications. Right? So our astronauts that will be on the South Pole of the moon, if they happen to go behind a hill and they can't see Earth anymore, they can't talk anymore with Earth, right? So that's part of the problem with going to the South Pole. But that gateway orbit that goes highly elliptical way over the South Pole dwells down, and they can be kind of a communication relay for the astronauts on the surface. There are portions where the gateway is also going to be over the North Pole, but for about 90% of its orbit, it'll have that coverage. And then radiation. So us here right now, it's very nice. We've got the atmosphere blocking a lot of the sun's rays, and there's also the magnetosphere, which is blocking a lot of that radiation, diverting some of those charged particles that come from the sun. And so the ISS, the International Space Station, is in low Earth orbit, and it's out of the atmosphere, but it's still within kind of the umbrella of the magnetosphere. So it still has that protection. But going out to the moon, we won't have that anymore, or the astronauts won't have that anymore. So you got to consider that when designing your vehicles too. In addition to just the radiation affecting the astronauts' health, there's also how it can affect spacecraft. These particles, they hold a little charge. They can fly straight through the computers, and they can flip some bits, ones to zeros. And you can imagine, sometimes maybe it's just as simple as a light switch, but it could be something else. So you got to design your hardware to be protected against that. And now back to eclipses. What we're all here for, right? So got to do my eclipse spiel, and so here we go. So what is a total solar eclipse, right? So if you remember last year, there was an annular solar eclipse, and that is different. Total solar eclipse is cooler. And luckily, we are in the path of totality. And so then the question is, why was last year annular and this one total? What's going on? And really what it is the moon isn't in a perfectly circular orbit. It's kind of a little elliptical, so it gets a little closer and further from the Earth. And it just so happens this time, when the moon is going between us and the sun, it is closer, right? So move your hand closer to your face, you see less, right? Last year, it was further, and so it only covered some of the sun, not all of it. It left a ring around the outside. So that's what's going on with the total solar eclipse. As I mentioned, we are in the path of totality. Sounds pretty cool. So what that just means is that this band going across the U.S., everyone along that band is going to experience a total solar eclipse. Everyone else in the mainland USA will still see part of an eclipse. They'll see the moon kind of taking or covering some of the sun, but they will not be able to take off their glasses like we will during totality. I'll talk a little bit about that. Speaking of glasses, if you haven't gotten any glasses yet, there should be some available here. There's also some at other places around the community. The main library branch, we know we have a booth over at the Niagara Falls Welcome Center, other places where we're presenting. So, yeah, and if you happen to get your own from Amazon or something, I just want you to note this ISO 12312-2. I know it's fun, but that is a rating that real eclipse glasses have to go through, or a standard that they have to go through to actually protect your eyes. So make sure you see that when you get glasses. Even check ours, right? We brought thousands. So, and yeah, and another check is you can turn on your cell phone flashlight or something and put it up against your eye with the glasses on. And normally you shouldn't be able to really see anything in that cell phone light. Maybe you can see, right? So it really blocks out the light. All right, so I mentioned you can take them off. Oh, sorry, one more thing. The indirect viewing method. If you happen to lose your glasses or something for the eclipse, there could be other ways you can look at it. There's this indirect viewing method called a pinhole projector, where you poke a little hole in a box, and then it gets projected inside the box across. And so the back of your head would be looking towards the sun in this scenario. All right, so total solar eclipse. Talked about there'll be partial, so different parts of the country will see different kind of portions of the eclipse. For us, it'll start around, I feel like 2-ish, you get the partial eclipse, and then around 3:18 p.m., we will see total solar eclipse. That's when the sun is blocking it the moon is blocking the sun completely. At that point, you can take your glasses off. The sun is completely blocked. However, 99.9% coverage is not 100%. Is not total, right? So, if there's even a sliver of sunlight, then please do not take off your glasses because you can still hurt your eyes. And then the total solar eclipse will last around 4 minutes, and then it'll go back to passing through to the other side for that partial eclipse. But the partial eclipse is fun too, right? So total eclipse is going to look really neat, but the partial solar eclipse you can have some fun with. You can do indirect viewing methods. You can play with your hands, and you see this gentleman here. You expect little square holes, but it turns out they're actually crescent shaped. And same with the colander, or pasta strainer. Those are a bunch of circular holes, but the shadow from the eclipse is actually a crescent. So it's some fun ways to look at that, and maybe you'll see, look at sun shining through leaves in the trees. You might see that same effect as well. And of course, we're not just here to ooh and ah at it. We need to do some science too. NASA So NASA has 3 Eclipse sounding rockets that they're putting up. So there'll be one 35 minutes before, one during. If you're interested, come on in. No, okay. And then one 35 minutes after the peak of the eclipse. And the goal there is to understand how the eclipse affects the atmosphere, right? So we have these normal day-night cycles, and the atmosphere kind of heats and cools, right? And so you get into a regular pattern, but then you put the shadow across the middle of it, which can throw things out of whack, right? Well, I'm not talking like a disaster or anything. It's different. So we want to understand how it's different, why it's different. And so these sounding rockets will go up. They go up into space. They don't go into orbit. They do go up out of the atmosphere and then come back down. And all along the while, they're taking data on the atmosphere. In addition to that, what's really cool about total solar eclipse is that you get a nice blockage of the sun, and you can look at the very faint upper atmosphere of the sun. So us, with our naked eye, we probably won't be able to see these cool pictures, unfortunately, but NASA will be pointing all sorts of equipment in order to capture these kind of images. To get that data and understand the sun's upper atmosphere. And you can see, but really cool. And I would also encourage you to enjoy this. There's going to be a lot of people with expensive equipment taking pictures that I know they'll be better than mine. So I'll just look for theirs and enjoy the moment. And then there's also citizen science. So there's science y'all could do to help. And whether that's looking at the weather and reporting it, and there's links at these QR codes here, or listening to nature. So when the eclipse is happening, we'll listen to the birds, listen to the insects and other animals, and you'll probably notice it changes when the eclipse happens. Some might just stop, some might pick up. So recording that for us could be helpful. And then pop quiz: is this total eclipse? Yeah, good job. Yeah, it is not. All right, that is still a little glimmer of the sun in the top right there. So we would still not remove our glasses at this point. But when it goes out, it kind of looks like a flash almost. All right, so talked about the eclipse. Yeah, what about this moon trip? All right. So we talked about how heavy we need to be and all the things we need to protect against, whether that's radiation, we make sure we got power. There's also thermal things we have to worry about, and loads. And so what do we end up picking to do this mission? Turns out we awarded a contract to SpaceX, and so what SpaceX proposed and we accepted was this Dragon XL capsule. Currently they fly Dragon 2 to the ISS. They deliver crew and cargo with that vehicle. So this is all the guts and brains of that vehicle repurposed for the moon is the idea. And then kind of hard to see in the top left is the second stage of the Falcon Heavy. So they propose launching this on the Falcon Heavy, where they'll recover the 2 exterior boosters on drone ships, and then they'll expend the center core. They'll use all the performance from the center core. And that's just what DSL is working on. That's the mission we planned. But Gateway as a whole has all these other different parts coming together. There's international participation in building this gateway. So for Artemis 4, the first segment is going to be this power propulsion element with the solar arrays and Halo, as well as IHAB. All right, and so we see contributions from not just NASA, but or companies within the U.S. See contributions from ESA, JAXA, the European Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency. Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency. And actually a new partner is the UAE with, I always have to look at the name, Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center. So that is a very recent partnership, and that is new for them. And then of course, we're right next door to our Canadian friends who will be delivering the latest and greatest version of the Canadarm, which will actually be able to operate autonomously from human control. It'll inchworm around Gateway and perform tasks. So all these things need to get delivered to the moon. And so it's not just one trip, it's many. And with that, any questions? Kind of an abrupt finish.
So what's the overall timeline for all those components?
Like calendar dates. So right now, the launch of, PPE and Halo are actually going to launch together on top of a Falcon Heavy. And I think the goal is 2027. And then it has solar electric propulsion, which is very efficient but very low thrust. So that launch is going to not quite get them to the moon, and then they're going to spend a year getting out to the moon. And then IHAB, or International Habitat, is going to launch along with Orion in 2028. So 2027, that launches. It takes a year to get out, so it's out there in 2028. And then in 2028, Orion brings up IHAB and connects it to Gateway. And then each year after that is another new Artemis mission, and they'll bring up another piece. So 2029, they bring up the Spree refueling module, and then 2030, they bring up the airlock, and that is when Gateway is complete. And I guess in addition to when we bring up the Spree refueling module, the logistics module is actually responsible for delivering the Canadarm. So that same mission will bring both the arm and the refueling module. In 2029 is the goal. And then after that, it's just another moon mission every year. Unless we get more funding. Yeah, there's another question. Sorry, what?
What's the budget for something like this?
Ooh, that's where having international partners help. Yeah, the international handshake here is, it's like the U.S. is saying, hey, we kind of got this core vehicle, the PP and Halo, and we have Orion, which can bring crew up. And so whoever else, and then they're also developing the human landing system. So then, if anyone wants to go down to the moon, build me some stuff, or, in nicer words. So there's kind of a handshake deal where they'll build and bring up some modules, and in exchange they get seats on the rocket to the moon. But to answer your question, because I didn't, I need to look at the budget. The budget has recently been figured out, but for all of the SLS rocket, Orion, the logistics module, all this, it's in the billions. So NASA's budget overall is $26.5 billion, $27 billion. So less than that, but it's in the billions. Any other questions? All right, stunned to silence. Well, thank you all for your time. I hope you learned something. Appreciate you.
another question, what kind of other activities are you involved in?
This week, it's mostly presentations like this one, all scattered around the community.